Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Paki and I welcome you all to a guest lecture on Indian foreign policy brought to you by the Nepal Institute of International Cooperation and Engagement, Nepal. NIICE Nepal is an independent, apolitical, and non-partisan think tank whose belief lies in freedom, democracy, and a world free from conflict. We envision a world where sources of insecurity are identified and understood, conflicts are prevented or resolved, and peace is advocated. And all these webinars are just a step forward to make this vision turn into a reality. The topic for today's session is India's foreign policy, and our guest speaker for the day is Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, sir. It's a pleasure to have you today with us, sir. Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, sir, has served as India's Foreign Secretary, Ambassador to the United States, and High Commissioner to the United Kingdom. He has also been Ambassador to United Arab Emirates and High Commissioner in Nigeria and various other countries. Ambassador Mansingh, sir, is active in a number of international initiatives for conflict resolution, regional security, and sustainable development. As a member of an international group of elder statesmen constituted by the Brookings, Stanford, and New York University, he worked on a project entitled Managing Global Insecurity that resulted in a publication, Power and Responsibility, in 2009. Ambassador Mansingh is also part of track to dialogues between India and its neighbors, including Pakistan, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Nepal. In India, he is the President, Forum of Strategic Initiatives, Vice President, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, Professor Emeritus of the Foreign Service Institute at New Delhi, and the Global Envoy for International Buddhist Confederation, New Delhi. Welcome, sir. It's an absolute pleasure to have you today with us. And before I hand over the session to you, I'd like to put in notice of the audience that this session is streaming live on our Facebook channel. So please feel free to share, like, and comment. Furthermore, we as organizers expect you to mention your questions in the chat box for Ambassador Lalit to answer in the second half of the session during the question and answer round. With this, so I hand over the session to you for the next 40 minutes. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Paki. I wish to thank the NIICE and particularly Dr. Pramod Jaiswal for inviting me to speak to this very distinguished audience. It is at the outset, let me disclose that while I have served in senior positions in the government, I do not now work in the government, and therefore my remarks are going to be exclusively personal and don't represent the views of the government. Well, coming to the subject, India's foreign policy started 7 decades ago when Pandit Nehru established the basic architecture centered around the principle of non-alignment. India was just coming out of the trauma partition, during which 17 million people were displaced and 1.5 million people were killed. The foreign policy of India responded to India's national interests in the context of the Cold War and the emergence of 2 rival international camps led by Washington and Moscow, when Atal Bihari Vajpayee became the Prime Minister. Geopolitics had changed dramatically in the preceding 5 decades since Nehru. The world had become bipolar, but the US, the hegemon, was showing signs of fatigue. There were new emerging powers like India, China, Brazil, and South Africa. The policy of non-alignment had its relevance. Vajpayee moved away from the idealism of Nehru and fashioned a new foreign policy, which I would call qualified realism. Foreign policy became more comprehensive, with greater emphasis on economic growth and security. Non-alignment gave way to multi-alignment and strategic partnerships. Um, Coming to the current foreign policy of India, uh, Modi's foreign policy, I would like to describe this not as new policy, directions, the policy established by Mr. Vajpayee. I would under Narendra Modi because geopolitics have changed in the past 2 decades since Vajpayee. The new trends have been neatly summarized in a recent book by India's External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar. The extracts of that book have been widely published. According to Jaishankar, the following changes have taken place in India and in the situation in the world in the past 20 years or so. The world, number one, the world is reverting to multipolarity, with China gaining strength at the cost of the United States. For 2 decades, according to Jaishankar, China has been winning without fighting, and the US has been fighting without winning. Number two, the emerging global order is complex with many dimensions. Hence, the world will witness more multipolarity with less multipolarism. There will be an inevitable decline of global bodies like the UN and its associate institutions. Number three, major countries will be more nationalistic in their approach, thereby weakening multilateral rules. Number four, the world is reverting to a balance of power, not collective security. According to Jaishankar, hereafter we will see more a proliferation of frenemies, that is, countries that will be both friends and enemies at the same time. Number five, there'll be no return to bipolarity. Number six, new partners and new powers are rising in the world. Half of the 20 largest economies in the world today are non-Western. Number seven, there is going to be more result-oriented cooperation, not institutional cooperation. Number eight, the benign globalization that facilitated the rise of China has come to an end. And finally, number nine, the corona crisis is the most consequential global event since 1945, according to Jaishankar. That pretty well summarizes the kind of geopolitical changes that have taken place, which has led to a different direction in foreign policy under Prime Minister Modi. It has, for instance, Indian foreign policy turning more sharper towards realism, which is why my caption for foreign policy today is hyper-realism. Because there are major areas where existing foreign policy has not been effective, there are needs. There is a need to change direction. And so, Jaishankar has commented, and I quote, "A nation that has aspirations to become a leading power cannot continue with unsettled borders, an unintegrated region, and underexploited opportunities." So another important factor here in change of direction in India is that, according to Prime Minister Modi, economic growth has to become a priority, and it has become a priority in foreign policy. Jaishankar endorses this by saying that the economy drives diplomacy, not the other way around. So Indian diplomacy, according to the foreign minister, will now be more nimble and less dogmatic. It will have several balls in the air. It will, when required, pursue contrary approaches. For instance, in Jaishankar's words, they'll be reconciling of Howdy Modi, Mahabalipuram, and Vladivostok. What he referred to was Modi's 3 summit meetings within a short time frame with President Trump, President Putin, and President Xi Jinping. Others might see this as a contradiction, but that is essentially what Indian foreign policy is aiming to achieve. On the priorities for Indian foreign policy, Jaishankar has written, and I quote, "This is time for us to engage America, cultivate Europe, reassure Russia, bring Japan into play, draw neighbors in, extend the neighborhood, and expand traditional constituencies of support." End of the quotation. This, I think, is a pretty good summary of India's current foreign policy objectives. Now, since it is not possible to cover the entire spectrum of foreign policy within the limited time we have, I will focus on some key countries and areas which matter most to India. Now, even deciding on the shortlist has created a dilemma: which country to be kept in and which country to be left out. So I asked myself, which were the countries which dominated my attention when I was Foreign Secretary? And the answer I got was the USA, China, Russia, and Pakistan. Well, 20 years later, these are the very countries which are still on the priority list for India's foreign policy, with one exception, that Japan has become a closer partner of India than it was about 20 years ago. Let me now turn to the number 1 priority, which is the United States. During the 5 decades of the Cold War, the US was more of an adversary than a friend, because India's non-alignment was unacceptable to Washington. By the 90s, human rights issues, especially in Punjab and Kashmir, and India's nuclear program came under American attack. In the next 2 decades, however, there has been a dramatic change in Indo-US relations. Between 2000 and 2005 and 2008, the erstwhile adversaries concluded a civilian nuclear deal, a defense cooperation agreement, and a strategic partnership agreement. This has further been elevated to a comprehensive global strategic partnership. President Obama famously declared that Indo-US friendship was the defining partnership of the 21st century. And so that policy has continued with his successor, President Trump. Now, let me give you a few examples of the importance of the United States to India. The US is India's largest trading partner, with an annual trade of $146 billion, and the target is to raise it to $500 billion within a few years' time. The Indian diaspora in the United States, numbering about 4.4 million, is highly qualified, prosperous, and of late has been active in US politics. During the current elections, both the major parties are actively seeking Indo-American votes. The Republican campaign has made use of the Howdy Modi meeting between Prime Minister Modi and President Trump in Texas. And as for the Democrats, they have issued a separate manifesto on India for the first time in their history. And the fact that Kamala Harris, of Indian origin, is now the running mate of Biden, that has also drawn greater attention to India. A further factor, American universities just before COVID had 200,000 Indian students, the largest body of foreign students in the United States. And most important, India and the US have increasingly closer strategic and military cooperation with the signing of what is called the BECA just a couple of days ago. India is now at par with America's NATO allies in terms of access to the most sophisticated military technology that the United States has. Just consider the statistics. 20 years ago, India had virtually zero acquisition of American military hardware. Today, it has gone up to $20 billion with more deals in the pipeline. The frontline acquisitions from the US have been put to use in the standoff against China in Ladakh. There are currently around 40 high-level political and other dialogues at the cabinet and high official level. And there are two special mechanisms for dialogue, which is unique to India and the US. It is called the 2+2. When the defense and the foreign ministers meet their counterparts in the US in annual consultations. And this happened just 3 days ago. And the last, and then I have to mention that these dialogues have taken place invariably every year for the last 3 years. Now, let me turn to the results of the 2+2 meeting which took place in Delhi recently. The US expressed strong support for the quadrilateral dialogue, the quadrilateral cooperation between India, Japan, USA, and Australia. And significantly, the American leaders gave strong statements condemning terrorism from Pakistan and supporting India against the attack from China. So this will give you an impression of how important the US relationship is in terms of economic and strategic terms. Now, before concluding on USA, I'd like to address two quick questions which many of you might have. The first question is, how has Modi handled Trump? Because that's the often asked question. Well, my answer is better than most other foreign leaders. Now remember that Trump, being notoriously temperamental and often discourteous, Trump has alienated most of the closest partners of the United States, particularly the European leaders. But somehow he has enjoyed Mr. Modi's company and seemed to have enjoyed his close hugs. Okay? But the second question is, with elections 3 days away or 5 days away in the United States, how will Indo-US relations change after the elections? Basically, this is a question of who do you think will win, Trump or Biden? Now, my answer to the question is, it doesn't matter. So far as India is concerned, in my opinion, the Indo-US partnership is bipartisan in Washington. And whether it is Trump or it is Biden, there will be continuity of the strategic partnership with India. Biden if, since people know him less well than Trump with regard to India, Biden has declared on several occasions that he will establish even closer friendship with India, and as I mentioned, has issued a democratic manifesto special for India. So Biden, I think Trump or Biden, India will win, no matter who comes in. Let me now turn to another neighbor who matters, that is China. Okay. There's an interesting parallel between India's relations with the US and with China. With the US, it began badly and has ended well. With China, it began positively and has ended in a confrontation. Let me put it bluntly and perhaps undiplomatically. China is today and has always been the number one strategic adversary for India. There is probably more discussion in our media and within our think tanks on Pakistan. This is quite a phenomenon. But in my personal opinion, Pakistan is yesterday's threat. Today and in future, the threat to India is China. Now, why so? Let me give you the reasons why we consider China to be an adversary. One, we have 4,000 kilometers of disputed border with China. And there have been negotiations in the past 70 years, over 50 rounds of official discussions, including 22 meetings at the level of the National Security Advisor. And the result is zero. No progress has taken place because China is quite clearly not interested in a settlement. China is already in illegal occupation of 50,000 square kilometers of Indian territory and is still claiming more and more territory in India, including the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh. More recently, China has been active on the maritime front around India. After asserting its hegemony in the East and South China Seas, it has focused on the Indian Ocean. Between Djibouti on the African coast and Riap in Cambodia, China has set up a series of ports like Gwadar in Pakistan and Hambantota in Sri Lanka, which can be converted to military use if required. India sees this as a security threat for itself and for the countries in the region. Another source for India is China's quasi-alliance with Pakistan. Pakistan has been kept well supplied with military, nuclear, and missile technology from Pakistan. And with Chinese troops massed along the LAC in Ladakh, a two-front war is beginning to look possible. And finally, China has been active in working against India's international interests. From opposing India's permanent membership of the Security Council to unsuccessfully trying to block the inclusion of Pakistani terrorists and jihadi groups in the UN. As you all know, in April this year, a large number of PLA troops from China made a surprise attack on India on the line of actual control in Ladakh. The Indian army stopped them in the tracks, and several rounds of talks have taken place on de-escalation and disengagement. There is an uneasy truce today, and the levels of tension are high. What is particularly offensive to India is that between 1993 and 2013, the Indian government in good faith concluded a series of agreements and protocols to ensure peace and tranquility on the border. China has violated all of them. There is no country in which Prime Minister Modi has invested so much political capital and personal diplomacy as China. He has met Xi Jinping in a record number of 18 summit meetings in the last 5 years. After the Doklam standoff 2017, the two leaders met in informal summits at Wuhan in 2018 and exactly a year ago in Mahabalipuram and Chennai. And then came the great Chinese betrayal in Ladakh. Remember, this is the second time of such a betrayal. The first time was 1962. For India, after the latest aggression against India, it cannot be business as usual with China. Foreign Minister Jaishankar has forcefully stated on several occasions that the state of the border cannot be detached from the state of the relationship. In other words, China can't keep on committing aggression on India and yet promote close and friendly relations with our country. So to prevent any further mischief on the line of actual control, the Indian armed forces for the first time will keep troops in forward deployment throughout the winter months on the line of actual control. They're also making contingency plans for a conflict if we have to face it. China may have overwhelming advantage in terms of its total military capability. But on the India-Tibet border, Indians are more than a match. After all, 2020 is not 1962. India is much better prepared this time. There are strategic experts who are convinced that India can inflict even greater punishment on China if there is a confrontation on sea in the Indian Ocean. The international community has been by and large supportive of India, has condemned Chinese aggression. The most effusive assurances have come from the US, most recently from the Secretary of State and the Defense Secretary at the 2+2 meeting in Delhi 3 days ago. Now, whether or not there is an agreement on disengagement and de-escalation, India has already reset its relations with China. Large public contracts with Chinese companies have been cancelled. Chinese investments have come under the scanner, and popular Chinese applications like TikTok have been banned. The process of decoupling India from China has already begun. Now, let me turn to Russia as one of the countries in the shortlist. Russia was the sole strategic partner of India for much of the 5 decades of the Cold War. But Russia is not very much in the headlines in India too. And many experts have almost written off the importance of Russia. I think it's a big mistake. True, Russia is no longer the superpower that the Soviet Union used to be. Its domestic politics are unstable. Its economy is in deep recession. And yet, Russia is a global player and poses a serious military threat to the US and the West in Eastern Europe, West Asia, and Central Asia. The ties between Moscow and Delhi grew in strength under Nehru and reached its highest point with the Indo-Soviet Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation signed in 1971 under Indira Gandhi. There was a brief period of estrangement in the years after the Cold War, but ties have been restored in the past 2 decades. President Putin came on his first state visit in 2000 when India and Russia signed the India-Russia Strategic Partnership Agreement. It is true that India has moved faster and closer to the United States. The US example is at $146 billion, while India-Russia trade hovers around just $10 billion. But Russia, nonetheless, remains a close strategic partner with a dominant presence in two very important sectors, defense and energy. In defense, the bulk of Indian military hardware, approximately 70%, is of Russian origin, despite increased purchases from other sources like the United States, Israel, and France. India continues its heavy reliance on Russian fighter planes like the Sukhoi 30, on Russian nuclear submarines and other platforms. A deal was recently concluded for the supply of 5 sets of Russian Triumph missile defense systems, costing about $54 billion. And this against the threats of sanctions by the United States. So, to turn to the field of energy, Russia is a major investor in the nuclear power sector in India. After building 4 nuclear plants in Kudankulam, Russia has agreed to build 20 more reactors of 1,000 megawatt each in the next 20 years. Each reactor costs roughly $2.5 billion. India, on its part, has also invested in the energy sector in Russia, with over $8 billion in Russian oil fields, including the major oil field, Sakhalin-1. Now, Russia is a close partner of China also, which is a cause of discomfort to India. Nevertheless, Russia has always been supportive of India on international issues, and it has chosen to remain neutral in the current conflict between China and India, much to the anger of China. Let me assure you, Indian diplomacy is active in trying to bring Russia closer to India and perhaps a little distant from China. Fingers crossed. Let me now turn to Japan. Japan is a relatively new star on the horizon. India enjoyed long historical and cultural links with Japan, but politically, the ties were not particularly close. With Japan's strong aversion to nuclear weapons, India's nuclear weapons program, culminating in the tests of 1998, became a major dividing issue. The breakthrough with Japan took place in the year 2000, when Prime Minister Mori made a state visit to Delhi, against the advice of the Japanese Foreign Office. The credit, however, goes to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe for bringing India into a close strategic partnership. On his visit to India in August 2007, Abe addressed the Indian Parliament and spoke about the confluence of the two oceans, that is the Indian Ocean and Pacific Ocean. And he also proposed the idea of a coalition of maritime democracies in the Indo-Pacific region to face common threats. Abe was thus the creator of two seminal ideas, the concept of the Indo-Pacific and the idea of the quadrilateral or the Quad, which involves India, Japan, US, and Australia. Both these concepts reached maturity by the time Abe stepped down from his office recently. India's bilateral cooperation has been cemented through the Japan-India nuclear deal in 2017 and the acquisition and cross-servicing agreement in 2020. And the only other country, apart from the US, with which India has a two arrangement is with Japan. And this meeting has also taken place regularly. Now let me turn to Pakistan. Created in the bitterness of partition, Pakistan has remained unrelentingly hostile to India. The two countries, however, have gone in different trajectories after they became independent. India remains solidly democratic and secular. Pakistan is an Islamic state which has remained either under military rule or, like today, under military-controlled civilian government. Three elements have dominated India-Pakistan bilateral relations: Kashmir, nuclear weapons, and terrorism. Kashmir for Pakistan is the task of partition, but for India, Kashmir is an inalienable part of our nation. On nuclear weapons give Pakistan a feeling of parity with India. And they have a doctrine where they have declared that they will be used, if required, for attacking India and only India. For India, nuclear weapons are not weapons to be used. They are weapons of deterrence. And India has a doctrine of no first use. Cross-border terrorism is Pakistan's chosen instrument for a policy it calls bleeding India with 1,000 cuts. The ISI nurtured some of the most dangerous jihadi groups like the Lashkar-e-Toiba, the Jaish-e-Mohammed, the Hizbul Mujahideen, and the Haqqani network, whose task is to commit deadly acts of terrorism in India. Every Prime Minister of India, from Nehru onwards, has tried without success to negotiate friendly relations with Pakistan. None was as bold as Atal Bihari Vajpayee, who went on a trip by bus to Pakistan and signed the famous Lahore Declaration in 1999. But guess what? This gesture was rewarded a few months later by a clandestine attack by the Pakistani army in Kargil. Pakistan had to accept a military defeat and a humiliating withdrawal. Prime Minister Modi has also tried his hand at reconciliation. He invited Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif to his inauguration in 2014 and invited himself on a surprise visit to Lahore to meet Nawaz Sharif. True to Pakistani tradition, this was followed by a major terrorist attack at Pathankot and Uri. The Uri attack in 2016 was a turning point for Modi's Pakistan policy. It is my theory, very personally my theory, that Mr. Modi must have consulted Kautilya's Arthashastra to decide on the best strategy to deal with Pakistan. Kautilya offers a choice of 4 doctrines or 4 options: Sama, Dana, Bheda, and Danda. Since the first 3 had not worked with Pakistan, Modi chose the ultimate weapon, Danda, or punishment. In 2019 came another Pakistani-sponsored attack, this time at Pulwama in Kashmir. Modi ordered a surgical strike on terrorist complex at Balakot in Pakistan, deep inside Pakistani territory. The myth that the Pakistani army had perpetuated, that India will never dare to attack a nuclear-armed Pakistan, has now been demolished. India received global approval for this operation, which was seen as an act of self-defense. The diplomatic campaign to isolate Pakistan has also succeeded. You'll recall that at the UN General Assembly in September 2019, Prime Minister Imran Khan made a blistering attack on India and described Pakistan as a victim of terrorism. Well, guess how many countries supported Pakistan in this? 3 countries: China, Turkey, and Malaysia, out of the 193 members of the UN General Assembly. Pakistan today has been placed on the grey list of UN Financial Action Task Force, the FATF. The FATF incidentally met just a few days ago, between 21st and 23rd October. It concluded that Pakistan had not convincingly carried out the action plan that was imposed on it, and has given Pakistan time until February to ensure full compliance, otherwise face blacklisting by the United Nations. The SAARC summit, meanwhile, remains hostage to unstable conditions in Pakistan, including terrorism, widespread agitation against the army and the government, and the COVID pandemic. At the virtual meeting chaired by Nepal's foreign minister on 24th September, it was decided by the SAARC foreign ministers that the time was not opportune to hold the 19th SAARC summit in Pakistan. Now, let me come to India's more immediate neighbors, and let me have a little sip before I do so. This would be the concluding part of my presentation. But before I end with a brief survey of our neighborhood policy, I like to make a few very personal general observations. You may or may not agree with it, but at least we can have a good discussion based on what I think are my personal observations. Well, in this survey, I have confined myself to immediate neighbors. And as you have noticed, Pakistan has already been dealt with, because I think Pakistan is a case in itself and has to be in a separate category from the rest of our immediate neighbors. But as I said, let me give you some general observations. Number one, the Indian subcontinent is almost a continent, and I think all will agree with that. The enormous geographical, ethnic, and socio-cultural diversities, there is a striking commonality of culture, language, religion, and social traditions. I speak from personal experience to assume that any South Asian feels at home in any South Asian country. This homogeneity, however, does not easily produce a political consensus on major issues, unlike, say, in the case of Europe or Southeast Asia. I have not done any particular research on this issue, but my guess is that there is a feeling of uniqueness amongst all the countries on the subcontinent. And this is one of the reasons why it has not been possible to forge a common approach to each other's problems. And I think a few factors could perhaps be responsible for this. Firstly, a fierce sense of national pride, which I think is absolutely normal and acceptable. But the second is historical memories of being conquered or subjugated, which create mistrust. And the thought is again that this is natural, since national boundaries have undergone bewildering changes since history began in our part of the world a few thousand years ago. India is a prime example. Consider the fact that India, the largest country in the area, India, was ruled by rulers from Afghanistan for close to 400 years, including 200 years of Mughal rule. That large stretches of North India, from the Teesta in the east to Kangra in the west, were under Nepal's rule in the 18th century. Or that the kings from South India, particularly the Chola kings, ruled in northern Sri Lanka and in the Maldives for many centuries. So history may be one of the reasons why we have memories of mistrust, and subjugation amongst ourselves. I feel there is another area which requires more scholarship and research, that is the latent and often overt anti-Indian sentiments amongst the neighbors of India. Again, I will present my very personal observations. India is often perceived as a big bully of a neighbor which does not pay adequate attention nor share sensitivity to the sentiments of the smaller countries. Again, I would submit that this may have certain causes which we must be aware of. Firstly, this is a phenomenon that happens everywhere in the world between very large countries and their smaller neighbors. Secondly, it may be also due to the colonial experience of having been occupied by the British as a part of the Indian Empire. The rulers were British, but the ruling instruments were Indian. And therefore, there may be a memory of such differences. There may also be pent-up frustrations amongst neighbors about their size, their location, or the lack of resources. And part of that frustration gets directed to India. I'm tempted here to cite a proverb in my native Odia language, which says, Denga mundere thenga. What it means basically is that the tall man always gets hit on the head. And this is probably why there is sometimes so much frustration vented against India. I know the time is running short, but I would like to point to another factor which has not received enough attention, which is that India's foreign policy process has undergone a change. And the country is in transition from the unitary model the British had left to the federal model provided in the Constitution. And needs to be understood because foreign policy according to the Constitution is the exclusive domain of the central government, but in practice, the states have clamored for a share in it. The government of India is today sensitive to the public sentiments in Tamil Nadu in dealing with Sri Lanka, or with Bengal, West Bengal in dealing with Bangladesh, or even UP and Bihar in dealing with Nepal. The problem did not manifest itself under Nehru and Indira Gandhi because they managed to establish personal and almost family relations with the leaders of the neighborhood. But things changed dramatically since from the time of Rajiv Gandhi onwards. Let me come straight away to my brief summary survey of the 5 neighbors of India. Let me start with the smallest neighbors, Bhutan and the Maldives. Just because they are small doesn't mean important. Actually, important favorite neighbor. Why? Because we've had the least number of misunderstandings discussions. For instance, the 1949 treaty, which is not very different from Nepal's treaty of 1950, was taken up bilaterally, was discussed quietly, and revised in 2007. And whereas we still have this controversy. Nepal, again, has allowed its hydropower to be developed by India. It is self-sufficient in power and exports to India. And it has contributed to Nepal having per capita income in our region. Maldives is again another small country which gives us a few lessons. One is that interventions don't have to be offensive, because in India, in the Maldives, when President Gayoom was facing a coup d'etat from external mercenaries. He appealed to India for help. And India unhesitantly sent troops to, to defeat the mercenaries and to put President Gayoom and the government of the Maldives in power with no demand for a reward or reciprocity. There is another lesson from the Maldives. After nearly 3 decades of excellent relations, 2 recent presidents, President Wahid and President Yamin, turned hostile to India and played the China card. And here is the lesson. They also carried out an authoritarian government and suppressed the democratic institutions. Well, democracy has been restored in the Maldives, and President Soli has been elected by a landslide. And this has led to a change in the policy direction of the Maldives. And guess what? The Maldives has now approached India to help that country in paying back the loans they have taken from China because they cannot afford them. Something like $2 to $3 billion of loans at exorbitant rates of interest, which China had extended to the Maldives. Now let me come to the bigger neighbors, Bangladesh. Liberated from Pakistan in 1971, Bangladesh, like many other neighbors, has gone through domestic turbulence, including terrorism and long spells of military rule. Their polarized politics have often brought to power parties which are viciously hostile to India. Despite this, India and Bangladesh have an exemplary record of resolving their differences through friendly negotiations. Let me highlight some of these landmark issues. 1974, a historic land boundary agreement was concluded in just a few years' time. Unfortunately, this time India was at fault because of domestic reasons. The 74 agreement could only be ratified by India in 2015, but at least the agreement is in place. 1996, another landmark agreement to share the waters of the Ganga equitably between the 2 countries. 2011, there could have been a success, but Prime Minister Mansingh faced a diplomatic embarrassment. He went to Dhaka in 2011 to sign, among others, an agreement on the Tista. But he was unable to do so because the agreement was vetoed by the Chief Minister of West Bengal. And now you understand part of the problems of India's federal politics. Prime Minister Modi has assured that we are doing our best to get this agreement signed as soon as possible. 2014, another landmark reconciliation. Bangladesh and India had a dispute over their maritime, and they went for arbitration to the International Court of Arbitration. The, verdict given by the tribunal gave almost 90% of the disputed area to Bangladesh and the rest to India. India graciously, gracefully agreed to the verdict, and we have had very cordial maritime relations since then. There have been numerous smaller and larger agreements, including agreements on joint patrolling of the India-Bangladesh border, and translated for India to go through Bangladesh to reach the northeastern region. So we end with a very recent incident which happened. IMF has given in its recent report a prediction that this year the per capita GDP of Bangladesh will exceed that of India. And this has caused much distress and even outrage within India. I think it's a matter of celebration. I think it is no better tribute to India of assistance from India to come up and have a higher per capita GDP than India. I think we should be humble enough to acknowledge this, congratulate Bangladesh, and perhaps learn some lessons from our neighbor on how to manage our economy better. Sri Lanka, I know we are a country where nations, and a special factor is the presence of an almost 20% Tamil minority, which has repercussions on Indian domestic politics. But relations were fairly smooth in the time of Indira Gandhi and earlier under Pandit Nehru. But since then, there have been two military interventions. One in 1971, when the government of Sri Lanka was about to be ousted by a local militant group called the JVP, and India sent troops to make sure that the government's position was restored. And the other one was in 1987, a somewhat, in my view, a questionable decision by the Rajiv Gandhi government to send the India peacekeeping forces to Sri Lanka in order to disarm the LTTE. Well, as it happened, the operation was a disaster. The Prime Minister of Sri Lanka actively sabotaged the operations, and Indian troops had to come back in a humiliating withdrawal a few years later. The surprise for India was that after cooperating with Sri Lanka in getting the LTTE defeated, the first government of the Rajapaksas turned hostile and started playing the China card. In 2005, they signed an agreement with China, which promised everlasting friendship and mutual support. China invested close to $6 billion in infrastructure projects. But what caused maximum concern for India was the Hambantota port, which was built by the Chinese. They gave a loan to the Sri Lankans. And then when the Sri Lankans could not pay back the loan, they reduced the loan and took over the port for 99 years. The port is considered by India as a threat to India's security because of its proximity to India. Well, the Rajapaksas were out of power for the last 5 years. And it seems that in the past 5 years, both India and Sri Lanka have done some reflections on good neighborly relations. The Modi government has gone out its way to welcome the Rajapaksa brothers, Gotabaya as president and Mahinda as the prime minister. And the Rajapaksa brothers have also been outspoken in proclaiming their. And I think we have come close to a new between the two countries. President Gotabaya, when he came to India on his first foreign visit, said, do anything to jeopardize India's national interests. That's something that India wanted to hear. He also said that Sri Lanka will avoid being caught up. He also made it clear that Sri Lanka would continue to receive economic assistance from China and from other countries if it does not impinge on India's security. Asserted that the Tamil issue was matter for will be resolved. This case, we are on a good footing with Sri Lanka, and we look forward to good relations. Now, let me come to the most, what would think, the more dangerous, which is India and Nepal. And I will admit that I do not have sufficient knowledge and depth about Nepal. And although I have visited Nepal several times and I've dealt with Nepal officially, My assessment may have its flaws or shortcomings, and I'll be very happy if we can have a discussion to correct them. But let me start by saying that in many ways, it's a very unique relationship that does not exist between many countries, many neighbors. The fact that we have arrangements for visa-free borders, for access to employment and commerce, each other's citizens, and a military tradition that allows Nepalese citizens to serve in the Indian armed forces is something quite unique. They may be controversial in some ways, but I think all the same, it is quite unique. And yet, with all these commonalities, our relations in the past decades have often been difficult and sometimes hostile. There is a feeling, at least I get the feeling, that India thinks that India has acted as a big brother unduly. That is treated with respect, and the elder brother is often required to act like an elder brother when there is a particular problem within the family. And India has done that. In 1951, King Tribhuvan, asylum, and behind the scenes, India acted to bring to an end the Rana and installed the Nepalese monarchy in its position. And it's the same India that many decades later brought the Maoists into the Nepalese mainstream. And with the end of the monarchy and the emergence of Nepal as a secular democratic, then why do we have such differences between us, and why can't we have an understanding? The problem I see when I compare it with the other neighbors is that in Nepal, we do not resolve our issues and bring closure, and watch fresh problems come up and things more difficult. The 1950 treaty, to my mind, I think is entirely an unavoidable. Foreign Secretary, I visited Kathmandu for official discussions with the government of Nepal, and I was authorized by the Vajpayee government to offer to my counterpart, the Nepalese Foreign Secretary, 3 options on the treaty: continue the treaty, amend the treaty, scrap the treaty. India will be happy with whatever decision Nepal takes. Unfortunately, I didn't receive a response at that time for the entire period I was Foreign Secretary. And I dare say, it causes me surprise that 20 years later, we are still at the same spot. We had another difficult transition in 1989 with the Treaty of Treaties of Trade Transit. It caused considerable unhappiness in Nepal. There were strong public sentiments. Unfortunately, there was a blockade which lasted about 13 months, which caused great public distress. And here is my personal view, that no matter what happens between us as neighbors, there should never come a time, no matter how serious the difference, that we need to use coercive methods against each other. But sadly, another blockade took place in 2016. The Indian version is that the Madhesis did it, but the blame came on India. And I find that again, the blockade caused considerable distress to the innocent public. And again, I say that perhaps it was an aberration of Indian diplomacy. Now, I come to another sensitive issue, which is the China issue. China, according to, was one of the earliest neighbors to play, Nepal was one of the earliest neighbors to play the China card. It started in the time of King Mahendra and King Birendra. And there were agreements of $20 million of arms imports from China, which was contrary to all the bilateral agreements that India had with Nepal. And now let me refer to the latest one, the Kalapani issue. which is added to the long list of differences. This has caused a lot of misunderstanding because the Indian version is case of recent encroachment by India on Nepalese territory. It was decided between Nepal and the East India Company in a Treaty of Sagoli in 1860. It has come up as a bilateral issue. Well, I feel that, like in the case of Sri Lanka, perhaps the two countries have already come to a certain kind of realistic engagement and are ready to have normal and friendly relations. Recently, there has been a flurry of exchanges. The head of the R&AW has visited Nepal and has had meetings at the highest level. And next month will be another opportunity, next week, in fact, another opportunity when the Indian Army Chief and his delegation will be visiting Sri Lanka. So let me end by saying that maybe if we think on slightly different lines, we'll be able to have better relations with our neighbors. Modi has got a neighborhood first policy. And the China factor is again coming in the way. But let me make this offering that so far as India is concerned, I think there is a realization of the sensitivity of our neighbors. And I know it for a fact that in MEA, this is receiving serious attention. The China factor is there, but I think India has come to understand that our neighbors have every right to accept Chinese assistance, except that we have a red line, which is our security, and that needs to be accepted. Now, my suggestion for neighbors is for your consideration. Please try to understand that India's size and strength is not a threat to them. In fact, they should capitalize on India's strength and capability to strike better deals for themselves in their national interest, just as Bhutan and Bangladesh have done. I also thought that I was being original when I thought of a new formula. And I thought, if India has neighborhood first, why don't our neighbors get together, have an India first policy? And I thought I was going to propose this when I realized that the clever Sri Lankans have already used this term and have stolen my idea. But I'll explain the difference. In an article in the Times of India on 14th August 2020, Admiral Colombage, the Sri Lanka Foreign Secretary, wrote that in terms of an India first approach, this is his term, Sri Lanka cannot, should not, and will not be a security concern to India. But he spoke only about security. What I'm suggesting is that let us think about an India first program, which can be acceptable to all our neighbors, and then we can look forward to much better relations between our two sides. Time is solidly up, but I always end a serious discussion on a lighter point. And I want to record a little episode which might bring a smile to your face. You know that the question often asked is, what kind of global power does India want to be? And this was posed to Indira Gandhi. And she gave the reply that we will be different. Now, that was rather clever, but a rather mystical answer, because it doesn't say exactly what we want to be. So fast forward to Bangalore in around 2010, when I was speaking at a think tank meeting, and it was on nuclear doctrine. And I made a somewhat lighthearted remark that India is behaving like a vegetarian nuclear power. Sitting next to me was the late K. Subramaniam, the great strategic guru of India. And I could see from his face that he was not amused. And then he whispered in my ears, I will have you know that all the 5 top scientists responsible for the nuclear tests in India, South Indians, including Dr. Abdul Kalam, and all of them were vegetarians. So don't ever mention a vegetarian state. If any
Who said that if anyone has a question, we've received almost 50 questions over Facebook, Zoom, and already there were some sent in the form. So we wouldn't be taking all of them, obviously, but we'll be taking some of them. But before taking them, I'd like to summarize whatever you discussed. It's a very difficult task to summarize whatever you discussed because it was super comprehensive and uh, it's obviously a very difficult task for me at the end. Initially, you started with talking about qualified realism and you declared Modi's foreign policy as not a new foreign policy but a continuation of the old. You talked about Pandit Jaishankar's words. You focused on economy and the Indian foreign policy later on, and talked about Modiji's 3 summit meetings. Furthermore, you set your focal point on the priority list of countries for Indian foreign policy. USA, Indo-US relations, agreements and results were discussed by you. You also answered the question, how will the relations change after the US elections? And then you talked about China, maritime security, security threats, Pakistan, Russia, and nuclear weapons, no first use policy, terrorism, surgical strikes, and the SARC summit. You meant your own personal observations and declared India as a big bully. You talked about Bhutan as our favorite country and Maldives giving us a lesson that interventions do not always have to be offensive. And you talked about agreements with Bangladesh. You focused on Sri Lanka and India Nepal relationship, obviously, which according to you is a little controversial relationship, yet unique. And you talked about India being as an elder brother. Towards the end, you said that if India has the neighborhood first policy, its neighbors should also think about having a policy named uh, named policy of India's first. So thank you, sir. It was a very insightful discussion, and now we'll be moving forward to the questions. Listening to the first question, we have received the first question from Mr. Ajit. The question is, what are the soft power domains that India can employ to influence South Asia over the lucratives that China presents to India's neighbors?
Paki, I am a conservative so far as soft is concerned. I have dealt with soft power. I've been the Director General of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations, and for 5 long years I dealt with this. But as a diplomat, I am convinced that soft power is not really an instrument that a country can use. Soft power is not a foreign policy choice. It's the reputation of that country. Democracy, for instance, you can't use democracy as propaganda. You can't use culture as propaganda. Therefore, India is what it is. India represents a certain idea for the world, which is why India is far more acceptable internationally than many other countries. You talk of Indian culture, Indian cuisine, Indian movies, cricket played by India, uh, yoga, and everything else. But these are not the contributions of Indian diplomacy. They are what India is. When we look at the United States, we don't think of the United States as the country which has the biggest defense budget. We think of United States as a country with democratic institutions and which has the best universities in the world, which does the best science and technology research, and so on. So the short answer is, I know that soft power is a great asset in the hands of India, But I disagree when people say, let's use soft power as diplomacy. In fact, it cannot be a soft power diplomacy. The author of this idea, Professor Nye himself, has diluted his theory by saying there is hard power and soft power, but you cannot use soft power without actually having hard power. They are not interchangeable. And then he came up with the idea of smart power. I think that is the answer. Act smartly. If people like your culture, okay, it's good for you. But people will not change their policies just because they like Indian food or they like Indian movies. That would be my response.
Thank you so much, sir. Moving forward to the next question. It has been sent to us by Mr. Dibakar. How might India-Japan relations unfurl in the light of the latter's new PM, Yoshihide
Sorry,
Suga?
please say that slowly.
How might India-Japan relations unfurl in the light of the latter's new PM, Yoshihide Suga?
I still can't hear clearly. Just speak a little louder and slower.
Okay. Sir, am I audible?
A little louder, please. Yeah.
Am I
Okay.
now audible, sir? Okay.
Yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
the question has been sent to us by Mr. Dibakar. How might India-Japan relations unfold in the light of the latter's new PM Yoshihide Suga?
India, whose relations? India-Japan relations.
India-Japan. India.
In the light of
Yes, sir.
the new PM.
New PM.
Okay, okay. Excellent question.
Yes.
Now, as I mentioned, Abe is the real architect of this strategic partnership, and it has moved forward very fast under Abe's prime ministership. So there was a lot of disappointment and concern as to what would happen to this after Abe stepped down. But the fact is, the new prime minister has made a very firm declaration that Abe's policies will continue, and particularly in two areas. With regard to the Japan's relationships in the Indo-Pacific, and with regard to quadrilateral. And so when the foreign ministers of the Quad met in Japan recently, it was Mr. Suge who actually chaired the meeting, and he has come up with strong support for continuity. So we have absolutely no doubt that the strategic partnership with Japan is here to stay. And in fact, India's Indo-Pacific policy will collapse if Japan is not the linchpin of that.
Thank you so much, sir. With this, we move forward to the next question. The question has been sent to us by Ms. Anushka Saxena. The question is, what should be India's strategy on Nepal, considering they are already opposing India's political interventions, but a good Indo-Nepal relationship is important for the success of WIMSTEC and other such regional frameworks?
I completely agree with this, that good Indo-Nepal relations are not only good for the two countries, but they're good for the region. And I'm glad that she has raised the question of the BBIN. The BBIN cannot move forward unless there is basic agreement between the four countries, and Nepal is a key player. So what can we do to make Indo-Nepal relations better? First is we minimize hostility by sitting down and hearing each other. Perhaps enough, but I think there is realization in both capitals that needs to be done. And India, at least as far as I know, is pretty serious about this. Remember that when Modi went to Nepal, it was a prime minister coming to Nepal after 12 years. But he has taken it seriously. He's been there several times. And he also believes that Nepal's friendship is essential for the success of our neighborhood policy. How can we do it? India realizes that you can't grumble about what China is doing, and therefore there are two choices. You can match what China is doing and do better and please your partners, or say, okay, let China do what it can and India will do what it can. We have different capabilities. It's not simply expressed in terms of how many dollars you get. If the Chinese are good at certain things, let them do it. They want to build bridges and roads and airports. Great, why not? India has certain strengths. India has educational institutions that give the highest kind of education. And we are happy to receive thousands and thousands of students from our neighborhood. India has scholarship schemes for each one of our neighbors under the ITEC, under the ICCR, and many others. Nepal has a particular advantage. There is no limit to how many Nepalese can come and work in India and earn money in India and even have important government positions. So this advantage should be taken forward, and we shouldn't start bickering on small issues. This is the big lesson. And for India, I think the lesson is humility, that we must listen to the views of our neighbors, we must sit down in conversation and not have a superior attitude as many of our neighbors think we have. I think things are looking better to me on Indo-Nepal relations.
Thank you so much, sir. We now move forward to the next question. Is there any possibility of having a positive dialogue with China?
Positive or political?
Positive.
Positive dialogue with China. Well, actually, what we have been practicing for the last 70 years is a positive dialogue with China. Remember, the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai days from Pandit Nehru's time, and then came 1962. And for nearly 14 years, our relations were frozen. Then it was Rajiv Gandhi who went to Beijing and broke new ground, and relations were established. Patient process of dialogue, we agreed on 4 agreements to maintain peace and tranquility on the border. And then China has done it again. Now, we are still having a dialogue with China, and many Indians are angry because they thought, put a stop to this, this hasn't worked, now try something else. But we are still discussing the border situation with China, and the next meeting of the military commanders is due to take place very soon. But I feel personally that a bridge has been broken, that a point of no return has come, because you can suffer it twice. But if you suffer betrayal, suffer it once, but if you have a betrayal twice from the same neighbor, I don't think that trust can continue. So who knows? Different times, different regimes, different dialogues, there is still hope. After all, we were adversaries of the United States. We are strategic partners now. Why shouldn't we be friends with China? We have no quarrel with the people of China, their culture, their heritage. There is much that we admire China. We must have an understanding on the basics, and they need to understand that they have to respect our territorial integrity, just as we have repeatedly affirmed.
For the day, the question is, factors, domestic and international, going to shape years?
I will deal with this as a simple question, not as a complex question, right? Because I will not comment on domestic issues, either of India or of our neighbors. But going forward, India had reached about 8 to 9% growth in the early part of this century, after suffering almost 0 to 2.5% growth in the first 30 years. So we now have the takes fast. And so with the kind of economic policies followed by the Modi government, Atmanirbhar Bharat, and increasing investments from foreign countries in India, manufacturing, high technology is something that India is one of the leading countries of the world. All these are to our advantage. And mind you, even militarily, the future wars are not going to be fought by soldiers, each other rifles. Future wars will be based on technology, on cyber capacity, on space capacity, and so on. So India is on the cusp of a breakthrough because of its science and technology and its knowledge of what makes successful growth. What will give India a handicap is obviously if there are domestic disturbances, as we have seen happening in many countries. But I don't think that is likely because we have established strong institutions. The press is free, the Supreme Court is providing justice, and no matter which government is in power, our citizens are confident that we have a constitution which is sacrosanct. And with this confidence, I think India will be able to go forward. Secondly, if you look at the number of countries that India is friendly with, it will outnumber any other country in the world. And so I think there is abundant goodwill. And if we get our economy straight, there is no doubt that India will become one of the leading powers of the world. And not an aggressive power, not as a coercive power, a power that works for peace and prosperity.
Thank you so much,
Thank
sir.
you, Pati.
Thank you. Thanks a lot, sir. We have come to the end of the session, and I'd like to thank Ambassador Lalit Mansingh, sir, for agreeing to be a part of this session. Also, on behalf of NICE, I would like to acknowledge our gratitude to our friends from the diplomatic community, experts, academia, media, and different organizations. Finally, I must mention our deep sense of appreciation for our audience who participated in this webinar enthusiastically and those who are watching us live on our Facebook channel. Thank you for your valuable time and attention and for making the session productive with your questions. We're truly honored to have you all with us this evening, and we hope to stay connected with you in future as well. It's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.